Where is Niagara Falls? Chapter 1. Where is Niagara Falls? It was a beautiful hot summer afternoon in 1960. 7-year-old Roger Woodward was excited. He and his older sister Deanne were about to go on a boat ride. It was Roger's first time ever in a boat. They were going out onto the Niagara River in a motorboat that was just big enough to hold 3 people. "Remember to wear your life jacket," Roger's father called out to him. His father knew they needed to be careful. They were going on a river that led to the biggest, most awesome waterfall in America. The man who owned the boat was a family friend named Jim Honeycutt. Jim was a strong swimmer and lifeguard. He knew all about how to stay safe on the river. He made sure Roger kept his life jacket on. As they passed under a bridge, Roger asked if he could steer the boat. It was a bad idea to let Roger steer right then. The boat was nearing a dangerous part of the river. Most boaters knew to turn around there. The river was full of rocks and rapids that led to the edge of Niagara Falls. But for some reason, Jim said yes. Suddenly, the boat hit something hard under the water. The engine screamed. A piece of the motor was broken. They couldn't drive the boat away from the rocks. The rapids were pulling them toward the edge. Jim grabbed some oars and began to row as hard as he could. He shouted to Deanne to put on the only other life jacket in the boat. Powerful waves tossed them up and down. When a huge one hit the boat, all 3 were thrown into the swirling, raging rapids. Roger tried to hold on to Jim, but the water ripped him away. People on the shore saw what was happening. They ran up and down, but no one could figure out a way to help. Roger felt himself being bounced against rocks. Then he was dragged over the edge of the gigantic falls like a fly being flushed down a toilet. No one had ever survived going over Niagara Falls without something, a boat or a barrel, to protect them. But somehow, a miracle happened. Roger found himself floating in the water below the falls. A tourist boat happened to be nearby. Someone spotted Roger's red life jacket and fished him out of the water. He was saved. Roger became famous that day. He was the first person ever to survive going over Niagara Falls without protection. When he grew up, he became a sailor. He loved the water and even joined the Navy. His sister survived that day too. She was pulled out of the river before ever reaching the falls. But Jim Honeycutt died in the terrible accident. Sadly, he was not the first or last to lose his life to the biggest, most awesome, and most dangerous waterfall in America. Chapter 1. A Terrible Beauty. The first people to see Niagara Falls were Native Americans. We don't know for sure what happened, but we can imagine. At some point, Native Americans probably paddled a canoe along the peaceful river that divided 2 pieces of land, what is now the United States and Canada. Suddenly, the water began to run a little faster. They probably heard a noise. What was it? Rushing water. Before they knew it, they were being pulled toward the edge. They might have paddled toward the riverbank. Some might have reached safety. Others might have gotten caught up in the rushing rapids, gone over the falls, and died. Or perhaps the first Native Americans came upon the falls on foot Imagine their surprise at seeing a huge wall of crashing water. We know that was the reaction of the first white man who saw Niagara Falls. In 1678, a French priest named Father Louis Hennepin set out with a group of men from Europe. They traveled through Canada, across the river from what is now New York State. The men wanted to build a fort near the river. As they pushed their way through the trees, they saw a huge mist. Then they saw the gigantic falls, Niagara Falls. The wall of water was more than 160 feet high as a 15-story building, and it was 20 times as wide as it was high. It was actually 3 waterfalls stretching across the river, not just one. Together, they were more than half a mile wide. Father Hennepin was so terrified when he saw the falls, he began shaking. He dropped to his knees and started praying. When he glanced at the falls again, he quickly turned his head away. He was too frightened even to keep looking. Later, he said he was seized with horror. When he got home, Father Hennepin wrote about Niagara Falls. He called it the most beautiful and at the same time most frightful cascade in the world. He said the sound of it was more terrible than thunder. 70 years later, a Swedish man named Per Kalm saw Niagara Falls. In 1751, his travel diary was printed in English. He said, "You cannot see it without being quite terrified." The bodies of dead bears and deer were found at the bottom of the falls. Even birds flying over Niagara Falls got so wet from the spray they were sucked into the falls and killed. Soon, Niagara Falls became a place that everyone in the world wanted to see. But what would they find when they got there? Nature at work. 2 million years ago, the earth was covered with ice. As the huge sheets of ice melted and moved over time, they dug into the earth and carved out rivers and lakes. The Great Lakes and Niagara Falls were both formed this way about 10,000 years ago. The Great Lakes are huge. They hold 1/5 of all the fresh water on earth. The water in the lakes is always running toward the sea. The water from the 4 biggest lakes, Superior, Michigan, Huron, and Erie, flows into the 5th lake, Lake Ontario. But first, all that water has to move down the Niagara River and over the edge of a cliff. The flow of the water over that cliff created Niagara Falls. Why are there 3 falls instead of just 1? Millions of gallons of water rush down the Niagara River. But right at the lip of the cliff, there's an island in the way. That island is called Goat Island. It forces the water to go around it on either side. On the west side of Goat Island, the water creates the Canadian Falls, also called the Horseshoe Falls. It's the biggest waterfall at Niagara. On the east side, another small island divides the falls into 2 parts, the American Falls and a smaller waterfall called Bridal Veil Falls.